For in 1 hour is thy judgment come. Babylon falls quickly. Things can change very, very rapidly. See, if I end up running from the Lamb when he reappears, something has gone terribly wrong in my life. The Messiah not only has to fulfill all those Old Testament prophecies, not only does he have to die in the exact year that Daniel chapter 9 says, but he also has to accept the guilt of every human sin right before he dies, and then die within that 24-hour period. I will pay the penalty and I will die that same day. God never forces the mind. So first, Jesus prayed that those who follow him would be separated from the world based on what this book says right here. So God has his sign, and the devil has his mark or his sign of authority. And it's up to us to decide which way we will go. Good evening, everybody. I thought I was going to blow away last night and this morning. Our motorhome was going like this.
That's just the beginning.
But we walked out the door this morning and the kids said, our little rug is gone. I was afraid I'd have to chase it down the street, but it had just fallen underneath. So anyways, it's good to be here with you. A few nights ago, we looked at the topic of creation. And we looked at some things in astronomy and space, as well as things within our own bodies, and saw some pretty compelling evidence that the Bible is true, right? That God created us just like the Bible says. Tonight, we are going to look at probably the other story in the Bible right after the creation story that is most doubted or contested by the world, and that is the story of Noah's flood. So our topic tonight is DELUGE, geologic evidence of a global flood. Now there is a lot that we could talk about in connection with the flood. We're going to limit ourselves to the surface features that we can all see on the surface of the earth. So you don't need special training in geology, which is good news for me and maybe for you as well. These are things that are easily visible that you can see as you're driving down the road or look at pictures of the surface of the earth. We're not going to talk about the fossils either, even though that's really interesting. We'll have to save that for another series sometime. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 tells us this: By the word of God, the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. Now, if you remember the creation story, there in Genesis chapter 1, on day 1, God creates light, and on day 2, he separates the waters, doesn't he? And by the end of day 2, you have the waters above the firmament, and then there are waters beneath the firmament. And we'll see here that as the flood progresses, God is essentially undoing or reversing his work of creation. The waters that were above come crashing down, and the waters that were beneath come shooting up. And everything in the middle has a really tough time for about 1 year. And God is, in many senses, setting the reboot button on creation. Here is a brief outline of the history of the flood. And this is all taken from Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8. And on the very left-hand side, you'll see a tally of the total number of days. So we start on day 0 here. The Bible tells us that in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, this is when the flood began, and the windows of heaven were opened. And then for 40 days and 40 nights, it rains, right? And those windows stay open for these 40 days. And it eventually reaches a height of 15 cubits, or about 20 feet above the highest mountains that then existed on the earth. The next number we're given is a few verses later, still in Genesis 7, and going into the early verses of Genesis 8, we have 150 days as the length when the floodwaters were really ravaging the earth. And at the end of the 150 days, the fountains of the great deep are closed, and then the waters began to recede after that. That lasts for a while. We go all the way up to 224 days, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains become visible. And one of the fascinating things that we'll just touch on very briefly is that mountains were rising at this time. A lot of the great mountain chains, like the Rocky Mountains, that we see on Earth today weren't there at the beginning of the flood, but by the time that the waters had receded off the land, they were still rising and maybe continued to rise for some of those mountain chains. Then on day 314, this was the 601st year of Noah's life. On the first day of the first month, Noah removes the cover of the ark. I guess that was his birthday present, wasn't it? We're going to look outside, see what we can see here. And then finally, on day 370, Noah and his family leave the ark. So just over 1 year they spent inside the ark there. Now, we're going to focus in on about the first four sections or time periods that we see here. So we'll just start with the very beginning of the flood. Genesis 7, verse 11 tells us, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Now, we don't know exactly what the continents looked like before the flood. We can be pretty sure that they didn't look like what they look like today, right? How do we know this? Well, beneath every single ocean, running basically through the middle of most of these oceans, the Pacific would be the exception here. The red lines that you see here, these are the mid-ocean ridges, essentially great mountain chains running down the length of the oceans. And especially the mid-Atlantic ridge you can see here runs almost from the North Pole down to the South Pole. So tens of thousands of miles long. And these represent where the tectonic plates, which the continents flowed on, were moving at the time of the flood. And the Bible is pretty clear in the verse we just read that the great fountains of the deep, opened up and shot upward. So there were probably great geysers of water under great pressure, as well as a lot of volcanic activity at the beginning of the flood here. And a lot of these mountain chains under the oceans are essentially underwater volcanoes. And what seems most likely happened as the flood began is these volcanoes, opened up, and the lava and molten rock from the interior of the earth would have started mixing with the ocean water, vaporizing it almost instantly. One video I was actually looking at today as I was finishing my preparations here, they were saying that it could have been up to 1,000 degrees Celsius as these volcanoes spewed out their molten rock, and then it fell back in the ocean. So that's extremely hot and would have instantly sent clouds of vapor into the sky, which then in turn would cool and add to the rain that's falling. So you can imagine the absolute chaos. Now, you can also see in this map here that it's pretty clear that as these mid-ocean ranges were growing, they were at the same time pushing the continents apart. This is what it looks like now. Again, we can't know exactly what was happening, but most likely the land masses were splitting apart and then maybe crashing into each other again, and then maybe splitting apart several times over the course of the flood. How do we know that? Well, here is an artist's rendition of what's often called Pangaea, and you've probably heard of that, this supercontinent that existed way back in the past. And in this drawing, you see North America kind of in the middle here, just a little bit to the upper left, and then right beneath it is South America, and then right next to that, to the right, you see Africa. And Europe then is kind of turned up this way to the going off of what is now Canada, and then Asia is almost looking over the globe like this. And what's interesting is that the Appalachian mountain range, which is labeled here, I don't know if you can see it if it's big enough, the Appalachian mountain range is butting right up against the mountains in Morocco, the Atlas Mountains here in Morocco. They were the same mountain chain at some point. And then there's also the Caledonide Mountains in Scandinavia, which were part of the same mountain chain. And they eventually, as the continents split apart, obviously became separate mountain chains, separated by vast oceans. Now, we'll come back to what happened to the Appalachian Mountains before we're finished here. Obviously, they're not as tall as the Rocky Mountains or lots of other very tall mountain ranges today. But there's pretty good evidence that they could have been among the highest mountains in the earth at some point, were it not for all of the erosion that took place as the water was rushing off the continents. But we'll get to that. So that's a very basic and very quick idea of what was happening at the beginning of the flood. There was great volcanic activity. The earth literally was splitting apart. The continents were sliding all around and crashing into each other, forming mountain chains, then splitting apart once again. Let's go to the next stage of the flood now. This is the first 40 days where obviously the water continues increasing in its level. And Genesis chapter 7 and verse 18 says, "The waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters." And I've highlighted the progression that you can kind of see in these verses. So verse 18 says that the waters prevailed. In verse 19, the Bible's a little more specific, right? It says the waters prevailed greatly. So you can see the rise of the waters here. And all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. And then verse 20, we reach the maximum height of the waters. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. Now, a lot of times, those skeptical of the flood story will say, okay, the highest mountain on earth today is Mount Everest, almost 30,000 feet. You're saying that the water was covered by 30,000 feet plus 15 feet of water? Well, no. The Himalayas, just like these other mountain ranges, would have risen in the later stages of the flood. So the Bible is not saying that we had to have that much water covering the face of the earth. Just enough to cover whatever the original landform was. Okay, so do we have evidence that the entire surface of the earth was at one time covered with water? And the answer is yes, there is very abundant evidence, and some of the clearest that we see is represented here with the White Cliffs of Dover over in England. These are 300 some feet tall, at least in this section here, and this is a solid chalk layer. And the only way this chalk can be formed is underwater. And it's composed essentially of coccoliths, which are algae, and then other larger animals. So you are seeing the remains of billions upon trillions of little tiny sea creatures in these chalk layers. Had to be formed underwater, under pressure. And geologists tell us that you can find these chalk layers everywhere in the world. They're not always as visible as we see here, but these chalk layers are found in all parts of the globe. So this is a strong indication that yes, indeed, the entire surface of the earth was covered with a layer of chalk, and it's composed of these same animal skeletons all over the place. Here's Mount Everest, and they found marine fossils way up high on Mount Everest. You can see the picture, it's probably a little dark and hard to see, of the fossil there in the lower right-hand corner. But very interesting that even way up in the Himalaya mountains, we find these little tiny marine fossils. So clearly these mountains at some point were underwater as well. Now we've got to talk about the geologic column, right? This is the vertical stacking of the rock layers. And I think we're probably all familiar with that. And if you've ever visited the Grand Canyon, what an amazing sight, right? You can see these layers just stacked like pancakes on top of each other. You can see it in other places as well. So let's spend a few minutes here talking about the geologic column. Now, it's divided into 4 basic groups, which you see in the left-hand column there. Starting at the bottom, you have what is sometimes called the primitive rock layers. These are where you find few or no fossils at all, and it's it's not the sedimentary rock that you get in the upper 3 levels. It's things like granite or igneous rock that comes from volcanoes, or metamorphic rock, which comes from heat and pressure. They come from other types of rocks. So what's interesting here is that the top 3 layers, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic, are all sedimentary rock. That means they're composed of sand, silt, animal remains or plant remains that are laid down. And at the Grand Canyon, of course, they're laid down in almost perfectly flat layers, just like this, without any interruption between. Now, the boundary between the primitive and the Paleozoic, if you look in the middle column, there's that Cambrian layer. And you've probably heard of the Cambrian explosion, right? This is that layer of sediment, the lowest layer of sediment that we find in the geologic column. And all of a sudden, whereas we had few or no fossils in those primitive rocks down beneath, when you reach this first layer of sediment, or the Cambrian layer, all of a sudden there's all kinds of small little invertebrate animals. And so in the conventional evolutionary viewpoint, they call this the Cambrian explosion. They believe this is when life first started appearing and evolving. Right above that, and I don't have it on this chart here, this would be in the Ordovician layer. There's another explosion of life where the variety of life expands greatly. So it's very interesting in these very first two bottom layers, this early sediment that is laid down, you find several explosions, so to speak, of life and variety. And if you look on the right side of the right column here, you see the life forms, and as you work your way up the geologic column, you get more and more complex forms of life, right? You start with those little unicellular sea animals, and then little invertebrates, and then amphibians, and then by the time you get to the Mesozoic layer, we have some plants that start showing up, and then reptiles at the top of that, and then the Cenozoic, which would be the most recent, or the last layer that is laid down. Then you come to the mammals, modern plants, and then finally humans. Now, the evolutionists look at this, and in their paradigm, the lower they're looking millions of years back, even billions of years. So under that paradigm or way of looking at things, they find the simplest animals down there. Well, that's what evolved first, and then you work your way up over time until you finally reach humans here at the top. From a creationist standpoint, we can see these top three sedimentary layers as stages of the flood. And rather than a record of life as it develops slowly over time, what we're actually looking at in the fossil record is a record of death, the animals that were buried first. And it also makes sense, doesn't it? That those smallest, weakest marine animals would get buried first. And then you'd get your fish and amphibians, and as you work your way up the geologic column, you get those animals that are stronger and more intelligent, that can avoid the waters for longer. And it makes sense that the humans would be at the top because, boy, if I'd been there in the waters, I'd be looking for a way to stay alive as long as possible, right? So same set of data, but depending on your paradigm, you can come out with very, very different results. So let's look now. This boundary line that you see, and I'll put a dotted or a dashed line here, this is called the Great Nonconformity. And again, this is something that geologists find all over the place, but it's most clearly seen out here in the western United States. Non-sedimentary rocks in the bottom half of our picture here, and then the sedimentary rocks are laid down in an almost exactly flat straight line. And what is interesting here, or challenging to the evolutionary view, is that under the evolutionary view, they believe that these non-sedimentary rocks on the bottom were laid down up to 1 billion years ago. And then the sedimentary rocks are maybe only 500 million years ago at the bottom. And so the problem that they have is that you have 500 million years missing between these two layers, right where that nonconformity is. Now, if you had any kind of rock, even hard granite, exposed for 500 million years, do you think at the end of that time period you'd have a tabletop flat surface? Or would you have the kind of erosion and canyons and scouring and scraping that we find today? It wouldn't be a flat surface, would it? So this is very challenging for those that have the conventional evolutionary worldview. Where's the missing hundreds of millions of years there? It's simply not there. It's not a problem under a creationist or biblical worldview, because what we're simply looking at are the first layers of sediment laid down in the flood. And these floodwaters, think of tidal waves, possibly thousands of feet high, washing over the continents. Under that kind of force and pressure, even granite would get scoured clean, like a hot knife through butter. And that's exactly what we're looking at here as these layers are laid down. Now here's something else interesting. These are all sedimentary rocks, and you'll notice that they've been bent and folded and twisted in all kinds of beautiful shapes. The only way that this can happen is if these rocks have been laid down and they're wet, and then other forces have acted on them to bend these half-dried layers of rock before they actually dry. Right? No matter what kind of rock, you can't take it and twist it like this, can you? Once it's dried, it's going to break if you try to manipulate it like this. So some really fascinating shapes that we see, and this happens all over the world. You can see just a couple examples: Greece, New Mexico, California. Here's a particularly beautiful example from Norway. This is an island, and look at the ship down there. Okay, this is one big rock sitting out there, and look at those massive layers of rock that have just been twisted and bent very beautifully this way. The only way that happens is if it's been underwater and it has not yet dried. So we're looking at a very rapid process, aren't we? Not something that has slowly taken place over millions and millions of years. Now let's go back to the Grand Canyon for a moment. Grand Canyon, more or less, is about a mile deep, so 5,000 some feet deep. And over much of it, the top 4,000 feet of the canyon are these layers of sedimentary rock that have been laid down. So what we are asking here, what we're going to look at is how many feet of sediment could have been laid down in the flood. And that's what we want to look at here. Just north of the Grand Canyon is what is called the Grand Staircase National Monument. And this stretches into southern Utah. And it's a very, very fascinating place. Imagine that you're standing close to the Grand Canyon at your back as you look at this picture, and then you're looking into southern Utah here, and at the very top on the horizon, this is Bryce Canyon National Park, okay? So you're looking like 50, 60 miles into the distance here. And what we see are multiple layers, and there's more layers than I've put on the labels here, but you get the point. The very pinkish layer at the bottom, these are the Vermilion Cliffs. And then you have in the middle the white cliffs, and then again up on the horizon are the pink cliffs. And that is what Bryce Canyon National Park is formed around. If we look at a cross-section of that, and I guess I'll have that slide in a minute here, there's about 10,000 feet of sedimentary layer that is exposed. Now that doesn't mean you're looking up 10,000 feet because everything has been slanted like this and then sheared off. We'll look at another slide of this in a little bit here, but these layers have been tilted like this and then sheared off. So you're looking at what represents 10,000 vertical feet of sedimentary layers that are no longer there. They've been swept back out to sea. Genesis 8 verse 3 says, "The waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated." So we're going to think for a few minutes here about what happened now in the later stages of the flood as the waters began to wash off of the continents. As destructive as the waters were as they washed over the continents, as it started draining off, it was just as destructive. So here are some examples of what they call paleocurrents. And this simply means the direction in which the sediments were laid down. And the arrow represents the direction of flow. I'll go this way, right, for you. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the little ripple marks, and the current would have been flowing perpendicular to those. And then in the bottom right, these are, I believe those are trilobites, little fossils, and you can see something interesting. They're all oriented the same direction, aren't they? And so that tells us that the current was flowing in the direction that they're all facing. This is a very clear clue that these were all laid down at the same time in water. If you just had a stagnant body of water, or even a river, and things were dying randomly at different times, they'd be falling this way and falling that way and so forth. But when they're all facing the same way, you know you have a very strong current that is flowing. So geologists look at these paleocurrents, or the direction in which the sedimentary layers are laid down. And a few years ago, they started looking at these over continent-wide sample areas, and they found something very fascinating. This is the Precambrian layer, so this would be the pre-flood layer, right? Those rocks that are there at the basement of the Grand Canyon before the first sedimentary layers were laid. And the arrows in these pictures represent the paleocurrents, or the directions in which they seem to be facing. And you'll notice it's just kind of here, there, and everywhere, right? Kind of random and scattered. But when we move up to the Paleozoic layer, this would be some of the early sedimentary layers laid down in the flood. All of a sudden, these arrows are all facing similar directions. And you can see that on a continent-wide scale, we're essentially going from the northeast down to the southwest, with a little variation there in the Midwest. This is very fascinating, right? We're talking about waves that are washing over the entire North American continent. If we move up to a little higher level, this is the Cretaceous, and now the direction has reversed, right? Now we're going from west back to east, and they're all essentially flowing that way. And if you look at the eastern United States, everything seems to be flowing south like this. So a summary of what they have found here in the North American paleocurrents. In the Precambrian, the North American paleocurrents are variable and show no distinctive continent-wide patterns. If you move up to the Paleozoic, the currents show patterns that are continent-wide and typically flow towards the southwest across the continent. Moving up to the Mesozoic, patterns are continent-wide and typically flow toward the east across the continent. And then when we reach the very top layers, these will be the final or last layers laid down in the flood. They are again variable and do not show continent-wide patterns, which makes sense, right? The great waves have stopped, and now water's maybe swirling around more at random, like it would have at first. Okay, now that's interesting. But they took it a step further, and they started comparing samples from the different continents. And then they took those samples and put them together. Now, you remember that supercontinent Pangaea that we saw a few minutes ago? They kind of mapped all of these onto that hypothetical or historical continent of Pangaea, and here's what they found. Just like with North America in the Precambrian time period, everything's kind of going different directions, okay? That would make sense. We would expect that. In the Paleozoic, look at these great waves sweeping over from Africa, continuing through North America, and even down in South America, which is in your lower left-hand corner. They're still flowing basically from east to west. These are great waves literally wrapping around the world. Now, this shouldn't be surprising, right? Think of the great tsunamis that we've had over the last couple of decades here. And we've seen how a wave of water can march right across the Indian Ocean or the entire Pacific. If there were no continents sticking up out of the water, what's going to stop these waves from just wrapping around the world? If we move up to the Mesozoic, you can again see transcontinental paleocurrents. It shifted a little bit, but still these lines cross over today's continents. Very, very fascinating. Moving again to the Tertiary, you can again see uniformity in the wave flow. So, paleocurrents, very fascinating. And I think this is relatively new science that they've come out with in the last several decades. Okay, let's move on now into the flood. And we're looking now at the end of the 150 days. And the Bible says in Psalm 104, beginning in verse 5, God laid the foundations of the earth that it should not be removed forever. Thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. Okay, so now we're going to think about the water washing off of the continents. And the Bible is pretty descriptive here, isn't it? The waters fled away at the sound of God's voice, and they hasted away. So this was not some gentle, just oozing back to the oceans, right? We should expect to see something with a lot of force and a lot of velocity and a lot of effect that we can see. So let's go back to the Grand Canyon and the Grand Staircase. On the left, you see a straight down satellite image of the Grand Canyon. And there's something very fascinating about the Grand Canyon, which you might know, and that is that the entire Grand Canyon cuts through what's called the Kaibab Plateau. But if you were to look at a cross-section, you can see it on the larger illustration there. The entire Grand Canyon is on an uplift like this. And the Colorado River cuts right through the middle of that. So something was happening different than today, right? Because there's no reason a river would choose to cut through essentially a mountain range like this. It would go around it somehow. So the Grand Canyon is actually raised up, and then if you look to the far right on the illustration, you see those different colored cliffs of the Grand Staircase. And if you look at the bottom of that illustration, you can see, looks like, rainbows of different colors. That is representing the different sedimentary layers that those cliffs of the Grand Staircase are composed of. And you can see how the whole thing is just tilted up like this, right? You're looking at it backwards. It's tilted up like this, and then it's been sheared off. And so as the waters receded off of the western North American continent, they took, at least in this area, the equivalent of 10,000 feet of sediment with them and just washed it back out to the ocean. That was called what they call sheet erosion. Makes sense, right? Just sheets of sedimentary materials being washed out to the ocean. The Grand Canyon then is more standard or typical erosion that we see today, just on a massive scale. Now, how was the Grand Canyon most likely formed? Well, as this water was washing off the continent, some of it got trapped. And you probably know that the Great Salt Lake used to be much, much bigger, right? They call it Lake Bonneville. And then up north in Montana and Idaho and eastern Washington, there was another great lake like this. And so the water got trapped in some of these basins, and then the dams that held them eventually broke. And essentially you could have had another flood even shortly after the flood itself, as these waters washed back out to the oceans as well. So the Grand Canyon was carved by something on that scale, a monster flood, possibly shortly after the flood proper. And then what we see today is just the remaining trickles of the Colorado River. What about continental shelves? Well, every continent in the world and most of the major islands have what we know as continental, or we call continental shelves. And this is sedimentary layers, sometimes up to 20 kilometers deep, lying off the coasts of the continents. Now, how did that get there? Well, think of all that 10,000 feet of sedimentary layer being washed off the western United States. It ends up getting dumped in these continental shelves. As the water reaches the oceans and then starts dropping, it drops those sediments there. There's an interesting statement regarding the continental erosion. Research shows an approximate average of 6,000 meters or 18,000 feet of erosion across the Blue Ridge and Piedmont provinces. We're talking about the Appalachian Mountains now, eastern United States. Another area is the continental margin off southwestern Africa. Estimates there show an average of 2,400 meters or 7,200 feet of rock eroded off the adjacent continent. Now, I'll show you pictures of South Africa in just a moment here, but don't miss what they're saying about the Appalachian Mountains. 18,000 feet, perhaps, of sedimentary layers just washed back out to the Atlantic Ocean. So that's why the Appalachian Mountains are not as tall as the Himalayas or the Rockies today. But if that erosion had not taken place, they would be, right there among the tallest mountains in the world. Most of the erosion of the central Appalachians appears to have happened along the Continental Divide in the Blue Ridge province and in the Piedmont province just to the east. These provinces consist almost entirely of exposed igneous and metamorphic rocks. Those are the basement rocks that we saw beneath that great nonconformity level. So they were stripped entirely of all of the flood sediment that was laid down. So think of the destruction, right? You have tens of thousands of feet of sediment washed up, and then it's all swept back out to the ocean as well. And incredible devastation. Now here is a map of southern part of South Africa. And maybe you can see the black dashed line kind of paralleling the coast, but inland a few miles. This is known as the Great Escarpment, and you can see a picture of part of it there on the right. Most of the interior South Africa is on a great plateau, but as you approach the coast, you reach this great escarpment where there's a sharp drop and cliffs in many places. And this is illustrating the same process that we've just seen in North America. Water rushed off the south continent, or southern part of the African continent, probably as that continent was lifting back up, and we ended up with this great escarpment here. You can also find giant ripple marks. Now, we've all seen ripple marks if you're on a large lake or maybe an ocean or even a river of some sort, These are gigantic ripple marks. These are in Russia. They also have found them up in Montana. And hundreds of feet apart, at least tens of feet high, and some of them are up to several miles long. And when these great lakes broke, that were holding back, inland seas essentially, they created these giant ripple marks in the surface of the earth. You can't necessarily see it if you're hiking on foot, but when you fly overhead, it looks exactly like the little ripple marks we're all familiar with, but on a colossal scale. So obviously all of this was underwater at one point, and the flow was tremendous as it passed through there. Okay, let's move now toward the point where the mountains become visible. Genesis 8 verse 5 says, "And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen." I'm not going to talk a lot about the mountain ranges themselves, but I want to point out an interesting landform that we do find all around the world. And these are called Inselbergs. This particular one is there. You can see the little red dot on the map in northwestern South Africa. And these are usually granite or some other kind of very hard rock that just sticks up out of a lower plane. And they're isolated. And how did they get there? Well, as this sheet erosion was washing the sedimentary layers off, for whatever reason, you'd have this harder rock that wouldn't get washed away at the same rate. And so this is what remains. But just imagine seeing that much sedimentary layer up to or maybe above the top of this particular peak over this entire plain. That's how much sediment was washed away. Here's another one in Western Sahara, another one in Brazil, and you recognize the one in Wyoming, right? Devil's Tower. Basically the same thing. We find these all over the place. Probably the most famous one is Ayers Rock down in Australia. It's a big hunk of granite, 2,831 feet tall, single piece of granite. And you can see the size of that desert that it is in. Just imagine that much sediment that was on top of Australia, and it's all gone, all washed away. Psalm 104 verse 8 says they go up, talking about the waters, they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys, unto the place which thou hast founded for them. So another interesting geologic feature, which again you can find all over every continent, I believe, are what are called strand lines. Now this example is from Scotland, and if you look very closely on the mountain walls on the far side of the valley, you can see horizontal lines. How many of you see that there? Very faint, aren't they? But there's at least 3 of them running in parallel. And I've tried to highlight them there with that dashed line. These are basically water levels of these great inland lakes, and the water would have been at the highest level for a while, and then it would have dropped for whatever reason. Maybe part of the dam broke, and then it held for a while, and then it dropped again, and so forth. Here's another example from the Great Salt Lake. And again, you can see those horizontal lines running roughly like this, showing that this Lake Bonneville was a big lake, wasn't it? There was a lot of water there at one point. And another example, this is from Montana. It's called Mount Jumbo, I guess for good reason. It looks pretty big. And you can see these horizontal lines, once again, just working their way down the side of the mountain here. And the last example, this one I found very interesting. I think we're on the the west side of Lake Ontario, and you can see that the trees are in the same lines like this. And so they believe that these are strand lines, not so much vertical, but just very gently horizontal like this. But as Lake Ontario slowly receded to where it is today, it left these strips of land that we see. Psalm 119, verse 160 says, "Thy word is true from the beginning, and every one of thy righteous judgments endureth forever." So the next time you're driving around someplace and you see all these fantastic shapes in the rocks, let it remind you, right, of the Bible's record. And I love driving around in the West out here because it's just so obvious and so clear. We have this record, and I believe God has preserved it in part so that we can not only be reminded of the event that happened, but as this verse points out, that, God is a judge as well. And we know why he sent the flood, because of sin. And so sin is a serious thing, isn't it? And we need to be reminded of that as we look at these things.
Got quite a few questions tonight.
Uh-oh.
First question is, do you think the flood righteous being lifted up in Noah's Ark is like an example of the rapture? I'll let you look at this to make sure.
Okay.
You can see what you think.
Okay, yeah. There are some very important parallels between the flood story and end-time events. Jesus made that clear in Matthew 24 when he said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man," the second coming. One of those parallels Jesus draws out. He actually draws the lesson very clearly here in Matthew 24, and he's talking about how people were surprised by the flood, right? So this is Matthew 24, verse 38. "For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered in the ark. And they knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Now, did the people before the flood have an opportunity to know that it was coming? There was a guy preaching by the name of Noah, right? For 120 years. And not only was he preaching verbally, but he was throwing his whole life into building this big boat. So there was really no excuse for the inhabitants of earth to not have an opportunity to understand and respond to the warning message. That's one of the lessons that Jesus is giving here, is that before he comes back at the second coming, there's going to be a warning message that goes out, and God will have people just like Noah that he is using to give that warning message. And the world at large is going to ignore it, just like it did before the flood. Now, there's a question about the rapture there, and I don't want to assume too much because there's different understandings and meanings of the rapture. But Jesus makes a very specific point. He says that the people that were taken away were the ones that died in the flood, right? He says, "Then shall two be in the field, one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left." Those that are taken in the flood are actually the ones that are destroyed. And he's drawing this lesson because some people will say, look, at the end of time, just before the very final events, there's going to be a rapture. Often that's called a secret rapture, where people will be taken away, and this verse is used. You can't really use this passage to support that idea, because the people that were taken in Noah's flood are actually the ones that are destroyed. So you don't want to be taken in a rapture at the end, at least a secret rapture with that understanding. You do want to be ready to stand in Christ's presence when he comes back. There is one other parallel, and that is that when the door of the ark closed, that was the final opportunity, right? Yeah. Those that were inside the ark were sealed, and they would be saved. Noah, the 8 of them, right? Noah's family. And those that were outside the ark, there was no way they were ever getting in. And their fate, their doom was sealed at that point. So sometimes the term close of probation is used to talk about this concept at the end of time, that a point comes in which every person's fate is sealed. Either you have the seal of God, which Revelation talks about. If you don't have that, then you'll have the mark of the beast, which Revelation also warns about. So there are a number of important parallels with the flood story.
Okay, the next question. It seems to take more faith to believe in evolution than creation because of all the evidence we see as we look around our world. So what is the appeal for an evolution worldwide?
Yeah, that summarizes the issue pretty well, doesn't it? Both viewpoints require a lot of faith because there's only so far back that we as humans can scientifically understand. And if you believe in the Bible, you can't get behind creation, right? It simply says God spoke and there it was. If you have an evolutionary worldview, under their models, you have a big bang, but before that, what happened? Where did everything come from that boiled down to that little dot and then went boom? We can only go so far. And so you reach that point, no matter what your viewpoint is, where you have nothing else but faith. And the difference is, as I see it, if you are an atheist, if you have this evolutionary worldview, at the end of the day, you come down to faith, but you have faith that nothing created something. Right? That's essentially what evolution boils down to, that nothing created everything. And if you're a Christian, if you hold a biblical worldview, then if you boil it down to the basic, you believe that God created everything, that somebody created everything. Which one is most reasonable? You'll have to decide for yourself, right?
The flood was because of sin. Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by fire and brimstone. Explain.
The flood was because of sin. So both stories, I think this is what the question is getting at here. If you have your Bible, let's turn to Genesis 6, because we're actually given several reasons why the flood, why God brought the flood. And there's three primary reasons that Genesis 6 brings out. The first one is in the first few verses. So this is Genesis 6, verse 1. It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. So there's intermarriage happening between the line of Seth, those who were essentially faithful to God, and then the daughters of men, which refers to the line of Cain. And this intermarriage between the righteous and the wicked was not a good thing in the eyes of God. He realized that if that were to continue, there would be nobody faithful on earth before too long. That was one reason. A second reason is found in verse 5. God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So, sin had reached a point where it was affecting the minds and the hearts of people to the point, where they were sinning continually in the mind, as well as in their actions. And the actions are the third reason. If you look down a few more verses to verses 12 and 13, actually 11, start in verse 11. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So corruption and violence, the outplaying of what was happening in the mind. Verse 12 says, God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So the same issues were at play, in Sodom and Gomorrah and the destruction of those cities several centuries later. Sin had reached a point where basically the inhabitants of Sodom, just like the inhabitants of the world before the flood, they'd reached that point where there was no return. And they had silenced the Holy Spirit's convicting work in their lives to the point where they were completely dead to the Holy Spirit's work. And when we reach that point, that's called the unpardonable sin. And that's what was happening there. The other reason God sent both of those events was to preserve at least a few people who were faithful to him. And he realized, if he didn't send the flood, that there would be nobody left faithful to him. And the Messiah had to come through somebody, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, obviously not a global destruction, but the book of Jude brings out that they were destroyed as a warning to us of the judgments of God. And the same thing that happened locally there at Sodom and Gomorrah will happen globally at the very end when God destroys the earth a second time with fire instead of water.
About what year BC was the flood?
I believe it was about around 4500 BC. You cannot, with biblical chronology, count backward and find an exact year of the flood. You can count forward from creation, and it's 1600 something. I don't remember exactly. So we can know from creation looking forward, pretty much right when the flood happened, about 1600 years after creation. But you can't make the connection between those from creation dates to the BC dates we're familiar with. We can get very close, but I think God has intentionally prevented an exact counting of the years. But roughly 4500 BC.
Okay. Next question, why did God send the flood?
Yeah, I think we just kind of looked at those reasons there in Genesis chapter 6. The violence, the intermarriage, the corruption in the mind.
It seems that the flood reveals an angry and dangerous God. What do you think?
You ever thought that? Why would the God that created the world end up destroying it? I think the things we've just talked about in the last few minutes can help us understand this. God does not enjoy anybody dying. He doesn't enjoy the wicked dying. The Bible tells us that. He does not delight in the death of the wicked. But he also hates sin enough that he will not let it go unchecked forever. And that's an aspect of God that sometimes I think we tend to forget. We like to focus on his love and those tender personal relational qualities, and thank goodness they're there, right? We serve a loving God. But God has a perfectly balanced character. In Hebrews 1 verse 9, it says that he loves righteousness and he hates iniquity. And we like to focus on the loving righteousness, but we can't forget that the hating sin or hating iniquity is also part of who God is. Why does he hate it? Sin destroys, sin separates, sin wreaks havoc everywhere it goes. And as destructive and horrible as the flood was physically, sin is much more dangerous. And that's one of the lessons God is trying to teach through this event, is that sin is going to completely destroy this earth unless God intervenes, and thank goodness that he has intervened.
One last question. What lessons can we learn from the Bible's flood record?
A lot of good questions. They're kind of all overlapping, aren't they? I think we've touched on that as well. That God preserved Noah and his family, didn't he? He didn't just pop out with the flood one morning and say, sorry, this is it, like that. He gave warning 120 years in advance. And anybody that wanted to had an opportunity to be in that ark. And it should be a warning to each one of us, shouldn't it, that it's very easy in our sinful and weak human state to neglect the warnings that God gives to us and to think that we're on the right track, just like the people before the flood. I'm sure they honestly believed that Noah was a lunatic, but they had every opportunity to know better. And so we need to each take that warning personally for ourselves and use this story as a motivator for us. God, where am I with you? Where is my relationship with you? Do I truly believe you? Do I really trust in your word? Do I have a genuine relationship with you? Or am I just kind of floating through life? Am I echoing what the world is doing, or even my good friends, or am I truly seeking to know you better? And that's a question we each have to answer ourselves, isn't it? believe you each have a response card, and I'd invite you to fill that out. The first item there says, I recognize that the earth bears record of a universal flood. If that's become clear or more clear tonight in the things we've looked at, just mark that first box there. The second line says, I choose to accept this record as evidence of the Bible's validity. So if your faith has been strengthened in what we've looked at, please check that second mark. And then as we invite you every night, if you've got other questions or anything related to the things we're studying that you'd like to talk about, please let us know and do my best to have a longer conversation with you. All right, looking ahead. We won't be here tomorrow night, but Friday night we will be back, and our topic is escape, how to prepare for Satan's final deception. So Jesus warned that, or he explained that the flood is a type or a symbol of end time events. We're going to look at some of those things that happen in connection with Christ's return.